A single text message landed on my phone, and in that instant, my entire world imploded. It was a cold, calculated dismissal, a betrayal so sharp it stole my breath, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, my life would never be the same. I was hunched over quarterly financials in my Dallas office, the stale air and fluorescent hum doing little to stir my focus, when the family group chat notification popped up. What came next felt less like family news and more like a public execution. My father's words flashed across the screen with no context, just a curt, unexpected directive. I stared at them, reading and rereading, as if the repetition might somehow soften their impact. 3 years of unwavering financial support, countless emergency loans, co-signing on mortgages and car payments, covering medical bills, credit card debt, all of it dismissed in a single text that lacked even the courtesy of an exclamation point. My hands shook as I typed my reply, keeping it deliberately simple, pristine. Anger, I've learned, makes you sloppy, and I refuse to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. The moment I hit send, my sister Chloe's reaction popped up. A thumbs-up icon. It felt deliberate, calculated. Then came a party popper emoji, and something inside me went completely, terrifyingly cold. I walked out of my office, not a word to anyone. My assistant called after me, but I was already in the elevator, already pulling up my banking app, already making decisions that would echo through the next several months of their lives. They wanted me to step away? Fine. I would step away so completely they'd feel my absence like a missing limb. Closing the credit line took 15 minutes. I'd opened it 2 years prior when my father's business hit a rough patch, a quick access to capital he promised was temporary. The balance sat at $127,000, and I'd been making the minimum payments myself for 8 months, always hearing next month will be better. Next, the car loans. Chloe's SUV, the fully loaded model she absolutely had to have because her social circle drove luxury vehicles. I'd co-signed because she was rebuilding her credit after a bankruptcy. My father's truck, purchased just 14 months ago when his old vehicle finally died. Both loans carried my signature, my credit score, my financial backing. I called the bank, demanding to be removed as co-signer. The representative tried to tell me it wasn't that simple, that the primary borrower would need to refinance. I asked for her supervisor. Then I asked for their supervisor. By the time I reached someone with actual authority, my voice had dropped to the low, steady tone I reserve for boardroom negotiations, the one that says, I will not lose. They gave me options. None were pretty for the primary borrowers, but all accomplished my goal. I chose the fastest route. Consequences be damned. The loans would need refinancing within 45 days, or the vehicles would face repossession. My phone started ringing before I even left the parking garage. Chloe's name flashed across the screen. I declined, then blocked her number in one smooth motion. My father tried next. Blocked. My mother's attempt came through just as I pulled onto the highway. Also blocked. My Dallas apartment felt different somehow when I returned, as if cutting those financial ties had physically lightened the space around me. I poured a glass of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion and sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. My phone buzzed with notifications from email addresses I hadn't blocked yet. Subject lines ranged from "please call me" to "what is happening" to "you're being incredibly selfish." I deleted them all without opening a single one. They taught me this behavior, actually. Years of ignored messages when I asked about repayment schedules. Weeks of silence when I questioned their spending habits. Months of deflection when I suggested downsizing or budgeting differently. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. I'd expected guilt or second-guessing, but instead, I felt something closer to relief. The weight I'd been carrying for 3 years had finally lifted. Over the following weeks, work became my sanctuary. I threw myself into projects, took on new clients, expanded my consulting practice into markets I'd been eyeing. Without the constant drain of family emergencies, I had mental energy to spare. My savings account actually grew for the first time in years instead of hovering perpetually near zero. The emails continued for about 2 weeks before they stopped. My mother tried the longest, her messages escalating from anger to bargaining, then outright begging. She'd never worked outside the home, couldn't comprehend that closing a credit line or removing myself as cosigner wasn't a personal attack, but a basic financial boundary. Chloe's emails carried a different tone. She accused me of sabotage, of being jealous, of holding grudges over childhood slights. According to her, I'd always been controlling and manipulative, using money to maintain power. The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. My father sent exactly 3 emails. The first demanded I reverse my decisions. The second threatened legal action for breach of verbal contract. The third, arriving nearly a month after the group chat incident, simply said, "You've made your choice." I deleted it along with all the others. Through mutual friends and former colleagues, bits of information filtered back. The credit line closure had triggered an automatic review of my father's business accounts, revealing irregularities that caught his bank's fraud prevention team's attention. Nothing illegal, it turned out, just incredibly sloppy bookkeeping that looked suspicious. Chloe's SUV situation resolved when her husband, a man I'd met maybe 3 times, somehow came up with the money to refinance in his name alone. He'd borrowed from his own parents, creating a new set of family tensions that had nothing to do with me. The truck proved more problematic. My father couldn't refinance with his credit score and debt-to-income ratio. He tried to negotiate, but banks rarely care about personal hardship when numbers don't align. 60 days after I removed my name, they repossessed the vehicle from his driveway at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I learned this detail not from my family, but from my Aunt Lena, my mother's younger sister, who'd always maintained some distance from the family drama. She called me on a Sunday afternoon, 12 weeks after everything imploded, her voice carefully neutral as she filled in gaps I hadn't even known existed. The business was struggling worse than I'd realized. My father had taken out multiple high-interest loans using the credit line as collateral. When I closed it, the entire house of cards collapsed. He'd laid off 3 employees and was considering bankruptcy. Chloe's marriage was on the rocks. Her husband resented being dragged into her financial mess and apparently had some choice words about her family's relationship with money. They were in counseling, but Lena wasn't optimistic. My mother had started working part-time at a grocery store. At 62, she'd never held a job in her adult life and was finding the adjustment brutal. She blamed me entirely, according to Lena, and had stopped speaking my name aloud. I listened to all of this while making dinner in my quiet apartment, processing the information with a strange emotional distance. These were consequences of their own choices, ripples spreading from decades of financial irresponsibility finally catching up with them. I'd simply stopped standing between them and reality. Lena carefully asked if I planned to reconcile. I told her honestly that I didn't know. The anger had faded, replaced by something flatter and more final. They'd shown me exactly how much my years of support meant to them, which was to say, nothing at all. That celebration emoji still haunted me in quiet moments. Life moved forward with surprising normalcy. I dated casually, traveled to places I'd postponed visiting, renovated my apartment with money I would have previously sent to my father's business. Friends who'd watched me struggle under the weight of my family's demands commented on how much happier I seemed, how much more present I was. My career flourished without the constant distraction. I landed 2 major contracts that elevated my professional profile. A headhunter reached out about a position I would have automatically declined a year ago because it required relocation, but now I actually considered it. Options stretched out before me in ways they hadn't when I was perpetually tethered to my family's crisis cycle. The first snowfall of winter arrived in late November. I was reading on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, tea cooling on the side table, when my doorbell rang. Not the buzzer from downstairs. Someone had gotten past building security. Through the peephole, I saw my father. He'd aged dramatically in 5 months, new lines etched deeply into his face. My mother stood slightly behind him, her posture defeated in a way I'd never seen. Chloe was there too, along with her husband, whose name I could never remember. They rang again, then knocked. My father called my name, his voice muffled but audible. They knew I was home. My car was in its assigned spot. Lights were visible under the door. Leaving would require walking directly past them. I sat back down on the couch and waited. They persisted for almost 20 minutes, alternating between doorbell rings and knocking. My father periodically called out that they just needed to talk, that it was important, that I owed them at least a conversation. The entitlement of that last statement almost made me open the door just to correct him. I owed them nothing, less than nothing, actually, given the 6 figures I'd poured into their various financial black holes over the years. But I stayed seated and silent until eventually their voices faded and the hallway grew quiet. I checked the peephole 30 minutes later. The hallway was empty except for an envelope slipped under my door. My name was written across the front in my mother's shaky, uneven handwriting. The envelope sat on my entry table for 3 days before I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from my mother, 3 pages long, outlining exactly how dire their situation had become. The business was bankrupt. They were going to lose the house. Chloe was getting divorced and needed to move back in with them, except there would be no home to move into. Medical bills were piling up from my father's recent health scare. The final paragraph was the ask, delivered with a kind of desperation that would have worked on me 6 months ago. They needed $185,000 to stop the foreclosure and keep the business limping along for another year. They needed me to co-sign on a new mortgage. They needed their daughter back, their rock, their safety net. What they needed, I realized while reading those pages, was a bank account with a pulse, someone to subsidize their refusal to live within their means, to enable their terrible decisions, to insulate them from consequences that might actually teach them something about reality. The letter went into the shredder. Not dramatically, not with any particular emotion. It simply wasn't relevant to my life anymore. They'd made it abundantly clear through that group chat dismissal and Chloe's celebration that I was expendable, a resource to be discarded the moment I questioned their choices. They'd drawn that line themselves. A week later, a different letter arrived, this one from an attorney. They were suing me for financial abandonment and breach of verbal contracts regarding family support. The lawsuit was garbage and wouldn't survive even a preliminary hearing, but it still required me to hire my own attorney and file responses. The legal fees would run me several thousand to defend against claims that had no merit. They knew this, knew they were costing me money I'd never recover, knew they were weaponizing the legal system to punish me for refusing to continue funding their lifestyle. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing they'd done in our entire relationship. My attorney, a sharp woman named Maya Rodriguez, actually laughed when she reviewed their filing. She pointed out at least 6 fatal flaws in their case before she even got to the second page. We drafted a professional but firm response, making it crystal clear that continuing this frivolous litigation would result in counterclaims for legal fees and harassment. The discovery process, brief as it was, proved illuminating. Maya subpoenaed their financial records, and what emerged painted a picture of dysfunction far worse than I'd realized. My father had been taking cash advances on credit cards to pay minimums on other credit cards, a spiral that mathematically couldn't sustain itself. Chloe had opened store credit accounts in my mother's name without permission, racking up charges that my mother was apparently too intimidated to report. Most disturbing was evidence that they discussed in writing, via email, strategies for manipulating me into providing more money. My mother had sent my father a message outlining my emotional triggers and how best to exploit them. Chloe had responded with suggestions about which bills to claim were most urgent to maximize guilt. These conversations dated back almost 18 months, spanning periods when I believed we were having genuine family discussions about their needs. Maya offered to include these emails in our counterclaim. The exposure would have been devastating for them, potentially opening them up to fraud investigations given Chloe's unauthorized use of my mother's identity. I declined, not out of mercy, but pragmatism. I wanted them gone from my life completely, and protracted legal warfare would only extend our entanglement. Still, knowing the extent of their calculations changed something fundamental. These weren't desperate people making impulsive mistakes under stress. They'd strategized, planned, and coordinated their approach to extracting maximum financial benefit from my sense of family obligation. The group chat dismissal hadn't been impulsive frustration. It had been a calculated power play. That backfired spectacularly when I refused to play along. I spent an entire weekend going through old text messages and emails with this new lens. Patterns emerged that I'd been too close to see before. Every crisis had conveniently arrived right after I expressed concerns about repayment schedules. Every emergency had been perfectly calibrated to be just serious enough to warrant immediate action, but not so catastrophic as to trigger deeper investigation into their overall financial health. My father's business troubles had never actually resolved because there was no business to speak of anymore. He'd been operating essentially as a contractor for over a year, bringing in sporadic income he'd inflated in our conversations to maintain the fiction of a struggling company that just needed one more bridge loan. The employees he'd supposedly laid off after I closed the credit line had actually been let go 6 months before that, victims of his inability to make payroll consistently. Chloe's marriage problems predated my involvement entirely. Her husband hadn't been dragged into her financial mess by my actions. He'd been contemplating divorce for over a year, according to emails Maya's investigator uncovered. My removal as co-signer had simply accelerated the timeline that was already in motion, giving Chloe a convenient external villain to blame instead of confronting her own role in the marriage's deterioration. Even my mother's return to work wasn't quite what it had been presented. She'd started a grocery store job 3 months before the group chat incident, not after. The narrative of my abandonment forcing her into the workforce at 62 was fiction designed to maximize my guilt. She had taken the position because my father's income had disappeared and someone needed to bring in steady money, but that reality didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. Maya walked me through each revelation with professional detachment, but I could see she was personally offended on my behalf. She'd dealt with contentious family law cases before, but she said, the calculated nature of your family's manipulation stands out, even in that context. Most family financial disputes involve genuine disagreements or misunderstandings. This was systematic exploitation dressed up as familial duty. They dropped the lawsuit 3 weeks later, but not before it had cost me close to $4,000. I considered it tuition in a very expensive course about family dynamics and financial boundaries. The money stung, but the clarity was worth far more. Christmas came and went. I spent it with Lena and her family, enjoying the novelty of a holiday meal that didn't involve tense silences or passive-aggressive comments about my career success making others feel inadequate. Lena's husband was a physics professor, their 2 kids were bright and funny, and nobody asked me for money, not once. New Year's arrived with a kind of cold that made your bones ache. I attended a party thrown by a college friend, drank champagne I actually tasted instead of gulping down for courage, and kissed a man at midnight who asked for my number afterward. Life was expanding into spaces I'd forgotten existed. The second appearance at my door happened in mid-January. Different cast this time, just Chloe, looking thinner and harder than I remembered. She didn't bother with the doorbell, just knocked and called my name with an edge of anger that carried clearly through the door. I answered this time, curious what new approach they'd workshopped. She looked startled that I'd actually opened up, then quickly arranged her features into an expression of wounded dignity. The house had been foreclosed on a week ago. She informed me they were staying with friends temporarily. My father's health was deteriorating from stress. My mother cried constantly. All of this was my fault because I'd abandoned them in their time of need over a simple misunderstanding. I leaned against the doorframe and studied her. Years of resentment that I'd never fully acknowledged suddenly crystallized into focus. She'd always been the favored child, the one whose mistakes were forgiven, whose debts were minimized, whose failures were reframed as unfortunate circumstances. Meanwhile, I'd been the responsible one, which apparently translated into an obligation to subsidize everyone else indefinitely. She was still talking, something about how family was supposed to stick together. How I was betraying everything we'd been raised to value. Her voice hit that particular frequency of self-righteous indignation that wealthy people deploy when consequences finally arrive at their door. I interrupted her mid-sentence with a question. Do you remember sending the celebration emoji? Her face went carefully blank. She tried to claim she didn't know what I was talking about, that she probably just clicked something by accident, that I was being oversensitive. The gaslighting was so automatic, so reflexive, that I almost admired the efficiency. This was who they'd always been, I understood with sudden clarity. The group chat dismissal hadn't revealed some new cruelty. It had simply exposed the dynamic that had existed all along. I'd been useful until I questioned the arrangement. Then I'd become disposable. I told Chloe that she needed to leave. She shifted tactics immediately, tears welling up on cue, voice breaking as she talked about how much they missed me. The performance was genuinely impressive. Years of practice had clearly paid off. When the tears didn't work, she cycled back to anger, called me selfish, heartless, a disgrace to the family name. Said I'd regret this someday when I was old and alone with no one who cared about me. The venom in her voice was clarifying in its honesty. I closed the door while she was still talking. She pounded on it a few more times, then eventually left. I poured myself wine and returned to the book I'd been reading, a thriller about corporate espionage that seemed quaint compared to family dynamics. The following week brought an unexpected encounter that crystallized just how completely I'd moved on. I ran into an old family friend, Sarah, at a coffee shop downtown. She'd known us for decades and had apparently been receiving heavily editorialized updates about our estrangement. Sarah approached my table with obvious hesitation, clearly uncertain whether I'd welcome the interaction. She started with pleasantries before carefully broaching the subject everyone really wanted to discuss. According to the narrative my family had been spreading, I'd cut them off without warning over a minor disagreement, refusing all attempts at reconciliation, displaying cruelty that shocked everyone who thought they knew me. My parents were devastated. Chloe was barely holding herself together, and the whole situation was a tragic example of how selfishness could destroy family bonds. I listened to Sarah's gentle reproach with genuine curiosity about how far the revisionist history had spread. She meant well, clearly hoping to facilitate some kind of reunion, convinced that whatever had happened could be resolved with honest communication and mutual understanding. Her faith in the fundamental goodness of family was touching but profoundly naive given the actual circumstances. When she finished, I asked if she wanted to hear my version. Something in my tone made her pause, and I watched her reevaluate her assumptions in real time. I kept it factual and unemotional. Walking through the timeline of financial support, the group chat dismissal, the celebration emoji, the subsequent harassment and lawsuit. I didn't embellish or dramatize. The bare facts were damning enough. Sarah's expression shifted from sympathy to confusion to dawning horror as she processed information that clearly contradicted everything she'd been told. She asked clarifying questions, and I answered each one with documentation I'd learned to keep readily available on my phone, screenshots of the group chat, bank statements showing closed credit lines, the lawsuit filing Maya had forwarded to me. By the time I'd finished, Sarah looked genuinely shaken. She apologized profusely for believing their version without question, for approaching me with judgment instead of curiosity. I assured her no offense was taken. They'd had years to perfect their narrative skills, and she'd had no reason to doubt people she'd known for so long. What disturbed her most, she admitted, was that my mother had specifically told her I'd refused all contact and was ignoring their attempts to apologize and make amends. The framing had positioned them as victims, desperately seeking reconciliation with a daughter who'd turned inexplicably cruel. Sarah had come to the coffee shop planning to advocate for forgiveness and family healing, not realizing the apology she'd been told about had never actually been offered. We talked for another hour, and Sarah filled in details about how thoroughly my family had poisoned the well with their social circle. Every mutual acquaintance had received some version of the same story, carefully crafted to generate sympathy and position me as the villain. My success, my new job, my move to Denver, all of it had been reframed as evidence of my selfishness and immaterialism rather than the natural result of removing myself from a toxic situation. She asked somewhat hesitantly if I wanted her to correct the record with others. I considered it briefly before declining. The people who really mattered already knew the truth, and I had no interest in engaging in a public relations battle with my family. Let them have their narrative if it brought them comfort. My life in Denver existed entirely separate from their drama, untouchable and unbothered by whatever stories they told about me. Sarah hugged me before leaving, promising to stay in touch, asking me to send pictures once I got settled out west. I appreciated the sentiment, but suspected we'd lose contact naturally over time. She was too enmeshed in the social world my family occupied, and I had no desire to maintain even peripheral connection to that sphere. My attorney called the next morning to inform me that my family had attempted to access my credit report, probably hoping to find something they could use against me. Maya sounded almost amused. She filed the necessary complaints with the credit bureaus and suggested I put a freeze on my reports just to be safe. February brought an unexpected windfall when one of my consulting contracts led to a permanent position offer with a substantial salary increase. The company wanted me to head up their new division, relocate to their headquarters in Denver, take on challenges that would have terrified me a year ago when I was drowning in my family's financial quicksand. The offer itself came during a video call with Mr. Davies and the executives, people I'd impressed during a consulting project that had exceeded every metric they'd hoped to achieve. They spoke about my strategic vision, my ability to identify inefficiencies and implement solutions, my leadership style that got results without burning out teams. Listening to them catalog my professional strengths felt surreal after years of family conversations that had focused exclusively on my utility as a financial resource. Negotiating salary and benefits became an exercise in recognizing my own worth. I asked for 15% more than their initial offer, then held firm when they countered lower. The old version of me, the one conditioned by years of family dynamics, would have accepted the first number out of gratitude and fear of seeming greedy. The new version understood that knowing your value and demanding appropriate compensation wasn't arrogance. It was basic professional competence. They met my number. Then they added a signing bonus I hadn't even thought to request, along with relocation assistance that would cover the entire cross-country move. Stock options vested over 4 years, but with an accelerated schedule if performance targets were met. The benefits package included things I'd barely considered: professional development budget, flexible work arrangements, mental health resources that felt pointed given what I'd shared about my year. I accepted the offer on a Friday afternoon and felt something unlock in my chest. This was what life looked like when you weren't perpetually poised for the next emergency call, the next crisis that required immediate cash infusion, the next guilt trip about family obligations. Telling my current employer proved easier than anticipated. They were disappointed but understanding, even offering to match the salary if I'd stay. I appreciated the gesture, but explained that the opportunity was about more than money. It was about growth, challenge, and honestly, distance from a personal situation that needed geographic separation to fully resolve. My boss, who'd watched me struggle through the family drama over the past year, nodded with complete comprehension. The move was scheduled for May. I spent my weekend sorting through belongings, selling furniture that wouldn't make the cross-country trip, preparing for a future that was finally completely mine. Friends threw me a going-away party where everyone commented on how much lighter I seemed, how the stress lines around my eyes had smoothed away. Each box I packed felt symbolic. Books representing intellectual curiosity I'd suppressed while managing family crises. Artwork I'd been too stressed to properly appreciate. Kitchen equipment for hosting dinners without worrying about emergency calls interrupting conversations. My apartment transformed from a space I'd merely occupied into evidence of a life about to expand dramatically. I hired professional movers after brief consideration of doing it myself to save money. Old habits die hard. That instinct to scrimp and save because someone might need emergency funds. Then I caught myself, thought, and laughed at the absurdity. I was moving for a job that paid nearly double my current salary. I had savings for the first time in years. The cost of movers was a rounding error compared to what I'd spent annually keeping my family afloat. The weeks leading up to departure brought unexpected moments of reflection. I drove past restaurants where I'd had tense dinners with my father, discussing business prospects that turned out to be fiction. Shopping at grocery stores where I'd run into my mother and endured passive-aggressive comments about how rarely I visited despite living 20 minutes away. Dallas was saturated with memories that ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively painful. Denver represented a blank slate, a place where nobody knew my history or had expectations based on who I'd been rather than who I was becoming. The prospect felt liberating in ways that surprised me. I'd lived in this city my entire adult life, had considered it home, but now recognized how much of my attachment was habitual rather than genuine. Home should be a place where you could breathe freely, not somewhere you felt perpetually braced for criticism. Lena called to congratulate me on the new job. Then carefully, she mentioned that the rest of the family had heard about my move through the grapevine. They were apparently devastated that I was leaving the state, though she noted with dry humor that their devastation seemed primarily focused on the increased difficulty of accessing my resources rather than genuine emotion about my absence. 3 weeks before my scheduled move, my mother showed up alone. It was different from the other visits, quieter, sadder, stripped of pretense. She looked older than her 62 years, worn down by months of reality that couldn't be argued with or manipulated away. I let her in this time, not out of softening resolve, but from simple curiosity about what final attempt they'd crafted. We sat in my nearly empty living room. Most of my furniture already sold or donated, boxes stacked in corners, waiting for the movers. She didn't ask for money. That surprised me enough that I actually listened when she started talking. She apologized, which I hadn't expected, though the apology carried qualifications and excuses that diminished its impact. She missed me, she claimed, though I noticed she couldn't articulate a single specific thing she missed beyond my financial contributions. What she wanted eventually was for me to stay in touch after the move, to not cut them out completely, to leave the door open for eventual reconciliation once things settled down. The request came packaged in the language of family bonds and maternal love, but underneath I heard the subtext clearly: don't close off this resource permanently. I asked her directly if she'd understood why the group chat message had hurt me. She looked confused, genuinely unable to comprehend what I was talking about. My father had just been trying to reduce family stress, she explained. Everyone had agreed I'd been too involved in their finances, too controlling, too quick to judge their choices. The fact that their choices had been objectively terrible went unmentioned. The reality that I'd been too involved because they'd begged me to be involved apparently didn't merit discussion. My years of bailouts and co-signing and emergency loans had been simultaneously essential and somehow also oppressive. She had rewritten the entire history in her mind. I realized in her version, I was the problem. Difficult, judgmental, impossible to please. The hundreds of thousands of dollars I poured into their various financial disasters had somehow transformed into evidence of my need to control rather than their need to be rescued from their own decisions. I walked her to the door after 20 minutes of circular conversation that went nowhere productive. She hugged me, and I let her, feeling nothing in particular beyond mild discomfort at the physical contact. She asked me to promise I'd call once I was settled in Denver. I said I'd think about it, which we both knew meant no. After she left, I sat in my half-empty apartment and thought about the concept of chosen family. Friends who'd supported me through this mess without asking for anything in return. Lena who'd maintained connection without expectation. Colleagues who'd celebrated my success rather than resenting it. People who understood that relationships were supposed to be reciprocal rather than parasitic. The final weeks passed quickly. I wrapped up projects, said goodbyes, loaded my remaining possessions into a pod for cross-country transport. My apartment looked cavernous without furniture, echoing in ways that felt symbolic of the space I'd created by removing toxic relationships. Denver welcomed me with spring rain and cherry blossoms. The new position was challenging and exhilarating, demanding skills I'd been underutilizing for years. My team was talented and motivated, grateful to have leadership that actually showed up instead of being perpetually distracted by family emergencies. I bought a small house with a view of the mountains, paid in cash using savings I'd accumulated over the past year. No mortgage, no co-signers, no one else's financial fingerprints on my fresh start. The freedom felt almost decadent. 6 months into my Denver life, Lena called with an update I hadn't requested, but appreciated anyway. My parents had declared bankruptcy and were renting a small apartment across town from their former neighborhood. My father's business was completely dissolved. Chloe's divorce had finalized, and she'd moved in with a new boyfriend who apparently had his own money problems. They'd stopped asking about me, Lena reported. Initially, there had been ongoing complaints about my cruelty and abandonment. But gradually, as they adjusted to their reduced circumstances, I'd simply faded from regular conversation. They found new scapegoats for their situation, new narratives that didn't require acknowledging their own role in their downfall. I thanked Lena for the update, and we talked for another hour about her kids, her work, travel plans she and her husband were making. It was easy and comfortable. The kind of family relationship that didn't leave you feeling drained. A year after the group chat that ended everything, I was sitting on my back porch watching the sunset when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was brief and to the point: "We were wrong. We're sorry. We love you." No signature, but the syntax was my father's. I read it several times, waiting for the surge of emotion that never came. They'd had a year to apologize. A year to acknowledge what they'd done. Instead, they'd sued me, harassed me, tried to manipulate me. Only now, after losing everything and exhausting all other options, did they think to offer the most basic recognition of their mistakes. The message got deleted without response, not out of lingering anger, but simple disinterest. They'd had countless opportunities to choose me, to value me, to treat me like family instead of an ATM machine. They'd consistently chosen otherwise, and now the distance between us felt less like estrangement and more like a natural conclusion. Life in Denver continued to unfold in satisfying ways. I dated someone seriously for the first time in years, traveled extensively when work allowed, invested in friendships that filled my time with genuine connection. The family-shaped hole I'd expected to feel simply never materialized. Sometimes I thought about that celebration emoji, the casual cruelty of Chloe's response to my departure. It had hurt tremendously in the moment, but in retrospect it had been a gift. The clarity I'd needed to finally stop setting myself on fire to keep them warm. They'd shown me exactly who they were, and I'd finally believed them. The ending wasn't dramatic. There was no final confrontation, no satisfying moment of them realizing what they'd lost. They'd simply faded into the category of people I used to know. Their impact on my life diminishing with each passing month until they became merely a cautionary tale I occasionally told about the importance of boundaries. I was happier without them, lighter, freer, more fully myself than I'd been in years. The realization brought no guilt, just peaceful acceptance that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away completely. They'd wanted me to step away. I'd simply taken them at their word and built a life they could never touch again. If you found yourself in my shoes, what boundaries would you have set, and how would you have enforced them?